Folks, welcome to another edition of, we're going to call it Bird of the Month for one last time. We're now switching to what I think is a more appropriate name, Wings of Kentucky. We called this program Bird of the Month. At first, we were sort of trying to workshop a title for it, and I think Wings of Kentucky is a much more appropriate name since we don't really just focus on one kind of bird. And today is going to be another such example where we don't focus on one kind of bird. In fact, we're going to dive into bird feeding basics. Now, we are not going to discuss everything there is to discuss about feeding wild birds today by a long shot, but we're going to discuss just a little bit of the basics to maybe whet your palate if you've been thinking about putting out a bird feeder and getting into bird feeding, which can be a very fun and rewarding activity. And we're going to cover a few different things, but the first thing we'll start with is the different types of feeders. For instance, this one I've shown here is a tube feeder. It's a very popular kind of feeder. It's so called because of its tubular shape. We'll talk about what a tube feeder is, how they work, what kind of birds like to feed from a tube feeder. This is a hopper feeder, which we will also discuss. Again, similar type of thing, what kind of bird feed goes into a hopper feeder, what kind of birds like to feed from them, etc. Similarly with a platform bird feeder, which I will confess is my favorite type of bird feeder, and we'll talk about why that is. And then we'll also talk about suet feeders. I also have a little bit of information here on hummingbird feeders. I'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch on that a little bit. But mostly we'll focus on these types of feeders and the birds associated with them. Let's talk about that tube feeder first. So tube feeder is basically any tubular feeder that's got very small perches, usually around the edges, but in the case of this one here, it's got all of its perches at the bottom. I believe this one might be one of the so-called squirrel-proof feeders where these little perches, they pull down if there's a lot of weight on them, such as from a squirrel. This is a more standard tube feeder. I think this one's designed for Thistle Seed, but you can see that they're both tubular, and typically the way feed is put into them is by taking off this lid part, or this lid part, sliding it up the handle, allowing you to dump feed in from the top, and it fills in that way. Birds will sit on the perches here or up here and pull food out of the little openings on the side. And a wide variety of birds will feed from tube feeders. I'm just providing a few examples here. One would be the house finch. This is an image of a house finch, very common feeder bird here in Kentucky. This is the male, of course, the more bright, colorful individual, and the female is a little bit streakier and drabber. Kind of an interesting thing about the house finch is that it's actually not native to Kentucky. So it is native to North America from the western United States. But this species is considered invasive here, or at least certainly exotic. Very cool little bird though, despite that. I try not to hold that too much against them, although I'd much prefer our native species. One native that is really common at tube feeders is the American goldfinch. This is the male in the summertime. And we'll talk more about why they like tube feeders. There's a particular kind of feed that they really go crazy for that's frequently put in tube feeders. We have the hopper feeder. So a hopper feeder is referring to any feeder that basically has sort of a big container of food kind of there, also known as a hopper. And that food hopper usually has like a little opening, so you can see a gap in the glass here. So this is a big sort of like polygon shape, and it's got two pieces of glass so the feed can be seen. And then there's a little opening at the bottom where the feed can come out, and a little bit of a tray where the birds can sit on the tray and feed on the food as it comes out of the bottom of that hopper. Here's another example of a hopper feeder. I would say they're probably one of the more popular feeder types, and a wide variety of bird species will feed from a hopper feeder. Northern cardinals really seem to like them. Blue jays really seem to like them. And of course, all the smaller birds that would feed a tube feeder will also feed at a hopper feeder. So American goldfinch, house finch, things like that. A suet feeder. So these are another really fun one. So a suet feeder is typically looks something like what I've shown here. And this one's actually shown from the back. You see these two little clips here. So it's like a cage, and you can pop those little clips and the cage opens up on one side. And usually you put a store-bought suet cake inside there. And suet cakes, they're weird. It's actually like you get this sort of like waxy, like whitish creamish colored stuff with seed mixed into it, and that's usually some sort of like animal fat or animal fat product that is got bird feed infused into it and put in there. Now you can actually just buy like beef fat and stick it in a suet cake feeder, and birds will love it. um, One thing that's cool about suet cake feeder is that it does attract a bunch of birds that don't like to eat seed. So there's seed in there, but again, like the seed is almost like secondary. A lot of birds will be just attracted to that suet like fat itself. Really common species that'll come to a suet feeder would be like white-breasted nuthatch, red-breasted nuthatch. All of the woodpeckers will visit a suet feeder. This is a downy woodpecker shown here. But the cool thing is, again, you'll get species like Carolina wrens and pine warblers and yellow-rumped warblers that don't normally visit a feeder that will come to a suet feeder. So they don't want to eat seed, but they will pick at the fat from a suet feeder. And you may be wondering, like, what the heck? Why are they eating fat? That's so weird. But in the wintertime especially, that fat and the protein can be really nutritious for birds. And occasionally, if you stumble upon like a fresh deer carcass, for instance, in the woods, I mean, you'll see like chickadees and other birds feeding on the fat of a deer carcass. So it's not that unusual. One thing you do have to be careful of in Kentucky and many other places too with suet feeders is they readily attract European starlings. So if you're trying to avoid attracting starlings to your yard, you might consider either not putting out a suet feeder, or they actually have starling-proof suet feeders, if you can believe such a thing. I don't know what all birds will feed from a suet or a starling-proof suet feeder, but like woodpeckers and nuthatches have no problem feeding from them. The way they work is that the suet is presented upside down, like it's covered from above, so the bird has to hang upside down to get the suet. But things like nuthatches and woodpeckers have no problem doing that, and starlings will not do that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a few types of feed you might put in your feeder. We're going to talk about 4 different kinds: black oil sunflower, thistle seed, safflower, as well as mixed bird seed. And we'll talk about each of those seed types here today. Oil sunflower seed, this is kind of a cool type of feed. It's actually the feed that I use the most often in my bird feeders. It doesn't seem like something that would, doesn't seem very special, but the thing that's cool about it is it attracts a huge variety of birds. Like almost any kind of bird that's going to come to your feeder and eat seed will eat black oil sunflower seed. As the name implies, it comes from a sunflower, very similar to this. My colleagues here at UK will tell you that I have a feeder here right by my office that I stock very heavily with black oil sunflower seed. And the birds go nuts for it, but occasionally seeds go underground. We've got chipmunks and things here that'll bury the seeds as well. And by the end of the summer, I have a huge garden of sunflowers that have resulted from the black oil sunflower seed. All kinds of birds like it, but I mean, some species that you will see at a feeder set up with black oil sunflower seed would be like eastern towhee, white-throated sparrows, mourning doves. But just a huge variety of birds will eat it. There are very few things that won't take black oil sunflower seed, but will take other seeds. Next up is thistle seed. These are really tiny little black seeds that are probably one of the more expensive seeds you can buy, but they're really nice because for some species of birds, mostly small finches, they're just absolutely like crack for these birds. And they are indeed the seed of a thistle plant. And one species that just absolutely goes bonkers for them is the American goldfinch. So you can see here we've got some females, we've got breeding males, and look how small these seeds are compared to the birds themselves. These are teeny tiny little seeds, and it's kind of a little bit weird to figure out even how they're getting them out. Well, you can barely see it. There's a tiny little slit in the feeder there and there's one next to each of these perches. There's one there. And the bird just delicately sticks its skinny little beak in there and pulls those thistle seeds out. You can also get, they call them a thistle sock. It's basically just like, it looks very similar to a white tube sock, and you fill it full of thistle seed. And goldfinches and other small finches will just cling to the side of it and pull thistle seed through it. Next up, we have safflower seed, which, as the name implies, comes from a flower called a safflower. And it's another favorite of really large-billed birds. Northern cardinals seem to really like it. Eastern towhees, again, really like safflower seed. Rose-breasted grosbeaks, which are kind of a fan favorite, really like safflower seed. It's quite a variety of bird species that'll eat safflower. It's pretty expensive, though. That may be one of the main reasons that I don't use it in my feeders here on campus. But there are a lot of mixed birdseed mixes that will contain safflower, which is nice. Here my slides are going backwards. That's so weird. Ruby-throated hummingbird with the male kind of in the middle of the frame here and the female on the right. One important thing that I think always comes up when I talk about hummingbird feeders is what to fill your hummingbird feeder with. And you can buy a commercial hummingbird feed, but my recommendation is that you don't really need to do that. You can actually create your own hummingbird feed by just making a mix of 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. Very important that you don't add food dye to that. So it's very tempting to put some red food coloring or some kind of dye in that. It's absolutely unnecessary. So the reason that hummingbird feeders work so well is that they have these like fake flowers, or more importantly, that they have these colored portions with red and yellow on them. And these are colors that really attract hummingbirds. You don't need the whole entire feeder to be red to attract a hummingbird. They're very good at finding small, colorful spots in their habitat to produce nectar for them. Now, in terms of cleaning, bird feeders do need to be cleaned occasionally. It's recommended that you clean your feeder every 1 to 3 weeks is usually what I recommend. And to clean a bird feeder, pull it down, take it apart, scrub it with hot and soapy water, or if you don't like to do hot and soapy water, you can use a diluted bleach solution with 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. That is not recommended for hummingbird feeders. They do not recommend you use soap for those. What I've seen is to just clean them with a scrubby brush and hot water. But one of the reasons why you want to take down your bird feeder, because I mean, you see this sort of thing, you're like, oh, all right, why should I clean my bird feeder? That sounds like some pointless BS, but it actually really is a meaningful thing. And one of the main diseases at your bird feeder, which can absolutely happen. So this is a house finch feeding from a bird feeder, and you can see that its eye is not looking good. So it's got conjunctivitis, and it received that conjunctivitis from an infection from Micoplasma gallisepticum. And Micoplasma gallisepticum is a very interesting disease. So you see the species epithet gallisepticum. So the galla part of that refers to chickens or poultry. Gallus means chicken, but really, as best as researchers from Cornell can tell, this disease actually came from turkey farms, and it was kind of a poultry disease, and house finches, like this guy here, contracted a strain of Micoplasma from a turkey farm. And that disease has now spread like wildfire across the United States, and our house finches are now widely infected with Micoplasma. Now, other bird species, mostly finches, but not strictly finches, a lot of other birds can get Micoplasma, but it's very often a house finch disease. The image that I chose for this slide is obviously one I found online. I specifically picked one that depicted the disease, so you can see that this bird is not well, but also I didn't want to disturb people. If you're feeling old, you should go to Google and type house finch eye disease, and you will see some pretty gnarly ones with birds that have enormous lesions. Their entire eye is consumed. And they can survive from mycoplasma, but as you can see, it clearly impacts their vision, right? So it makes them much more susceptible to predators, and that often leads to their demise right there. Or maybe their eyes are totally swollen shut and they just can't see, right? So that doesn't bode well. So this is the kind of thing that you would want to say, hey, I want to minimize this transmission at my bird feeder, so let's take it down and clean it. If you see a house finch with mycoplasma, definitely take down your feeders, sterilize them, and I recommend leaving them down for a week or two so that those infected birds can disperse and not continue to spread mycoplasma. The reason is for salmonella, which can affect a lot of birds. So this is a pine siskin, which is a little finch related to goldfinch, and they're kind of well known for being susceptible to salmonella, which can accumulate at bird feeders due to bird droppings. So that's another thing to be careful of. So in terms of like where you want to put your feeders, my recommendation is to basically put your feeders in places where you tend to see birds. So if you have a wide open lawn with like a big open space and want to put a bird feeder out in the middle of your lawn, maybe you'll get some birds there, but like, do you see birds out in the open usually? Well, a lot of birds like a little bit of cover. So here's a brush pile, for example, and this would be a great spot to put a bird feeder nearby because birds can hang out around this brush pile. If there's a predator, like a Cooper's hawk or a mammalian predator, those birds can retreat under that cover and get away. And they also feel more secure, and you're more likely to see more birds when there's cover nearby. So it sort of sounds weird. You would think, oh, if I'm putting my feeder here by this brush pile, the birds, I'm not going to see as many birds. Well, you'll actually see more because they feel safe enough to come out kind of into the open where you can see them. Whereas if you're putting your feeder out in the middle of a lawn, those birds have to brave flying out into the lawn to come to the feeder. And there are some birds that'll do that, but a lot won't. It's also good to put cover or put your bird feeder near cover just in case you're attracting predators, right? So you're concentrating birds in a small area where they're going to be more susceptible to a predator. So if a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk or something like that tries to come and prey on your birds that you've attracted with the bird feeder, it seems like the least you can do to give them somewhere to hide if that happens. Okay, I have to touch on squirrels a little bit here. Now in Kentucky, we tend to have 3 species of squirrels or squirrel relatives that are problematic at bird feeders. The first being the eastern chipmunk, the eastern gray squirrel, and the fox squirrel. So these are squirrels of different sizes that all can absolutely terrorize your bird feeder. And don't get me wrong, we'll talk about squirrel feeding here in a slide or two, and I think that squirrels are cool. All 3 of these are native animals, so they don't deserve all the hate that they get, including the hate that I'm giving them right now. But it can be frustrating, right? Because all 3 of these sciurids, they cache seeds and nuts, or it's also called hoarding. So they'll take big piles of seed and they'll store it away for winter. And that's great for them and very cool. But I don't necessarily want, 3 gray squirrels to eat, 10 pounds of bird seed a day and eat me out of house and home when I want to actually look at the cardinals and titmice and things like that. So we've devised a number of different ways, we as the bird feeding community, not we as me, to minimize the amount of feed that squirrels can receive from a bird feeder. My personal favorite method is the use of something called a squirrel baffle. And a baffle is like a curved piece of plastic or metal most of the time that basically just does not allow squirrel access to the feeder. So in this case, the tube feeders are hanging down and there's a baffle on top. So if a squirrel were going to climb down this chain, it's going to hit this and it's going to slide right off and have no access to the feeder. A more popular style is this, it's actually a flat piece of metal, but you curve it and clip it into place so that it forms like an upside down cone. and there's usually a little stopper here that you put on your shepherd's hook that keeps the baffle in place. So the squirrel will climb up the pole, and then he'll kind of get up into here and be unable to get around it. Or maybe he even get to here and he tries to jump, but he's going to grab this and slide right off. So here's what that looks like on shepherd's hook, and it can be a pretty darn effective way to keep squirrels off your bird feeder. And again, it's no shade to the squirrels. I love squirrels. I think they're really cool animals and they're totally native, but a squirrel or two could put this whole thing empty in an afternoon. Whereas it might last a week if only birds are feeding from it. One thing you can do to kind of minimize this is put out squirrel feeders, and there are feeders designed specifically to provide feed for squirrels, and that can be a great way to view these squirrels. And squirrels are very funny, like this big fat fox squirrel here just sitting there with a giant ear of corn. That can be very amusing to have access to some squirrels, as long as they're not devastating your bird feeder, and more importantly, devastating your bird feeding budget. Now I think the last little thing I want to touch on here are grackles and starlings and blackbirds. And I really like red-winged blackbirds and common grackles, but it can be a little much when you have 10 blackbirds at your feeder and they just absolutely devastate all the feed in a matter of like an hour or two. And starlings, of course, are not native, so we really aren't fond of those typically. These blackbirds and starlings can become problematic when you have huge concentrations of them. And usually it's something that you see in spring, during spring migration especially. These migrating blackbirds will just kind of like stop at your feeder and they'll totally clean you out for a couple of weeks. But if they're a problem, there are a couple things you can do. Namely, you can put out different kinds of feeds. So if you're going to put out thistle feed, you're not going to be attracting grackles and blackbirds with that. It's way too small for them to bother with. You can put out tube feeders. Tube feeders in general, I mean, blackbirds and grackles to a certain extent will feed out of a small tube feeder. But if it's too small, you're going to be minimizing their access to the feed and just minimizing the amount of feed they can take in. So that's a good way. And then if things get really bad, there are a variety of different cages you can put around your bird feeders. So this is a very small one here, but you get the idea where it's a small cage that allows things like goldfinches to enter, or even smaller or larger birds like titmice and things like that. But it would preclude a grackle from getting in here and feeding at this feed. So I believe that concludes